Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast. If you are looking for Friday Night Football, this is not the place. But this is the place for discussions of science fiction.
And weird alien psoriasis.
In literature and in pop culture and in other various forms of creative work. So we are specifically going to talk about a subject which is a bit of a downer, but is also really, really great, and that is war in science fiction. And this is a subject that we have touched on at various points in time. In respect to various specific texts. We've talked about it in respect to Starship Troopers. We've hinted at it in its relationship to Jeff VanderMeer's The Southern Reach trilogy. But today, our kind of central text that we're ripping off of actually has war in the title, and y'all may have heard of it. It is, in fact, Omar El Akkad's American War. And this is a text that I discovered or was recommended to me a while ago when it first came out as exceptional. And I looked at the front cover and I read some of the blurbs about it, and it honestly struck me as a little bit more of a war story than a science fiction story. And so I didn't get to it right away. I regret that. But I did mention it to you, Tony, when we were shopping in Coeur d'Alene at the very hungry moose.
The well-read moose.
The well-read moose. I always feel like the hungry caterpillar and the well-read moose somehow blur together. Anyway, so we were shopping there and you saw it. You looked at it then. What actually pushed you over the line to reading it? Because you actually beat me to reading it.
Accidentally. Well, Andrew had recommended it. And he said, my boyfriend had read it, I think right when it came out. And he went through it, and he recommended it, but he didn't really strongly recommend it at that point. He was like, hey, this was pretty good. Here's what it's about. You should get around to it. And I should have realized, because of the times that that's happened, that means it's really, really good and I'm going to like it. And I should have picked it up right away. But what sold me and why I picked it up when I did, like, I don't know, a month and a half ago, was that he said it was kind of like, it treated war and science fiction in the same way that Animorphs had treated it when we were kids. Like, it took this really realistic view of what happens to people, even when it was putting them in unusual circumstances, and it really, really focused on the people as opposed to some other works of science fiction that deal with war, which we will talk about. And I was like, ooh, now I really want to read that because reasons. And I found it right. So that's what got it. That's what got me into it, and I found so much more there that I loved, and it became one of my favorite books of the year so far. So.
Yeah, and then you pretty much pushed for me to read it.
I did.
I managed to get my parents, while I was visiting them briefly for vacation earlier this month, to place it on hold at their library because I was not able to get it through mine. And then I read it over the course of about a day and a half. So my experience of this book is very much the condensed emotional experience where you're on vacation and this is the only thing that is in your head at this point in time. So, and then I followed it up with a quinta whammy. I don't know. Like, I went to 5 national parks right afterward in sequence. And so I was away from people. I was away from stimulating conversations that might have shifted my brain away from the conversations happening in American War. So I pretty much was thinking about American War and Desert Solitaire and Christopher Kokinos' book about chasing meteorites around the world, all at the same time. And those were the things that were in my head. So that is a peculiar reading experience. And I feel like I have to mention it because it really colors how I received the text. But
yes,
I definitely agree that this is it's perhaps top 5 for the year. And I haven't even read Nnedi Okorafor's newest, or Sarah Gailey's newest, or N.K. Jemison's newest. So I'm speculating that it'll still be up there, despite the fact that there's all these great books left to go in the fall.
Yeah.
So let's dive into it a little bit. We have some fantastic show notes for the day. But I want to frame our discussion about science fiction around the conversation about what is the role of war in science fiction. Is it necessary to science fiction? A lot of science fiction authors, just by virtue of what's contained in their works, would seem to indicate that war is like an inherent condition of humanity. And so if we're going to do sci-fi, it's got to be present. But there are some other authors who are really pushing the boundaries of what the definition of war is, and we'll probably circle back to Jeff VanderMeer because we love him so much in reference to this conversation. But let me pose this limited sort of fragment of the question in your direction, Ed. What is, in your mind, the specific function of war in science fiction? What does it do that other storylines can't do in sci-fi?
Okay, so you said that a lot, like, kind of by virtue of its presence, war is making a statement about the author's belief in human nature or humans' definition, or the, you know, what sets humanity apart as a sentient species or an intergalactic presence or something like that. And because a lot of war is present in space opera, which is not, of course that's not true, and we're going to be dealing a lot with the exceptions like American War and Area X and other things. But I was just actually reading the entry for the Planet of Hats on TV Tropes today.
What is Planet of Hats?
So the Planet of Hats is not necessarily a science fiction specific trope, but it happens a lot in science fiction, where when you have, again, typically a space opera, within that space opera, you have your main characters meeting groups of aliens or groups of humans, colonies, governments, whatever. And those colonies or governments or groups will be defined by one characteristic. For example, the Ferengi in Star Trek are greedy with a side of misogyny. You have space elves, you have space orcs, you have species that are entirely to a individual defined by their desire for violence. And it was interesting because a lot of the entries for humans on the Planet of Hats page on TV Tropes were talking about how humans got saddled with the hat of diplomacy or community building, especially in big space operas like Star Trek and Babylon 5 and things like that. But, you know, I was thinking about this podcast, and I forget if it was noted on that page or not. I might have just, you know, read it there because I was thinking about it. But, you know, I had this thought that war making is also potentially a human hat. And to go back to Animorphs, that is one of the things that characters in that book series say a whole lot. That it's actually drawing on the Planet of Hats trope, and depending upon the characters you're dealing with, the human hat might be desire for freedom, it might be recognition of individuality, or it might be the fact that humans go to war kind of over nothing a whole lot. And I thought that was really interesting, especially because, you know, Animorphs is written for younger readers. Like, the fact that the human's hat is, we go to war and we like violence for no reason, is like kind of a really subversive thing to expose kids to. And I mean, it's accurate, but subversive. So this is all to get back at your question. What is the function of war in science fiction? Or what are the functions of war? I think that one of them is, you know, intentionally or not for some authors, to say that this is part of the human condition, that I believe human nature is such that it leads to conflict with aliens, with other humans throughout time. Like, the temporal boundaries don't matter, spatial boundaries don't matter. There is something about humans that says we want to go to war. And that's part of it. I also think that part of it has to do with allegory. That we find some conflicts like World War II and very specific parts like the fall of Rome, like the Vietnam War. Those are just so interesting to some folks that they want to write about it, that they want to read about it, but they want to mythologize it in some way or allegorize it in some way. I don't know if that's a word, but it is now.
It is now.
And therefore, science fiction kind of is the perfect venue for saying, let's take this thing that is important for whatever reasons in the cultural consciousness and the individual consciousness, and sort of turn it on its head and say, we want to see more of these images, we want to read more of these emotions, we need this for some reason, and get it more that way.
And it okay, so I think this transitions into another one of our talking points, which is the relationship between alternate histories and science fiction.
Yeah.
So right now we've got a spate of alternate histories that are making television. So we've got The Man in the High Castle is probably the most well-known example, and it really is really good television. If you haven't watched it, it's pretty good. And you also have, books that do the same thing. We all, both of us and Andrew off screen, read Robert Harris's Fatherland, which is, he is not primarily known as a science fiction author. In fact, I think the majority of people would consider him just a literary fiction author, because most of his work is just historical fiction of some shape or form. And his book, Fatherland, does something similar to The Man in the High Castle, in that it's an alternate history in which the Nazis have prevailed, and an exploration of what it would be like to live in that universe. And so looking at what you've been saying about how authors are using war to kind of frame our understanding of these actual wars that happened. So science fictional war as a stand-in or an allegory for real war. Take that to the extreme and you have alternate history, which we have traditionally kind of fit under the sci-fi umbrella, but not really. It's kind of its own thing, and it's never really been mainstream, at least not until 2015, 2016, where now it's suddenly becoming one of the ways in which we are going at sci-fi right now. So
and I think that part of it was that when alternate history was really coming into its own as a subgenre or a genre, it was written it was getting people's attention because it was written by folks who were known for science fiction, like The Man in the High Castle. And I think that has some to do with it. But if I think of more contemporary books that are alternate histories, like you said, Fatherland, The Plot Against America by Philip Roth, The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, those are folks who are not predominantly known for writing science fiction. Michael Chabon is kind of in every genre, but primarily known for literary fiction. Philip Roth, primarily literary fiction. But they tackled this sort of what-if question, both to do with World War II and its aftermath, like Fatherland. And I think both of those books get... I don't know, if anything, lumped in with literary fiction, but also kind of, they occupy this gray borderland for which there is no good, where do they go in a bookstore, or where do they go in a library with little stickers? There is no alternate history sticker in a lot of libraries. There's science fiction or fiction, and you can never tell. But if I can add one more thing before you jump in.
Oh, absolutely.
There's also a lot of crossover with books that are kind of telling alternate histories, but involving some more speculative aspects. And I think that Connie Willis's Time Traveler series is a great one. Again, if we're thinking of World War II, she has Blackout and All Clear, which follow some time travelers from the future who return to the World War II era in Britain. And same thing with At the Table of Wolves, which is a recent book that may be on my best of 2017 list. But essentially it's X-Men in World War II. What if there was a secret X-Men, people who have mutations that give them powers, and what if they were part of
isn't X-Men operations? Technically also World War II text? I mean, because weren't the X-Men...
Yes.
I mean, a lot of the origin stories like Magneto arise during World War II in the prison camps or elsewhere. You also think of a lot of our comic book heroes, Captain America, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera, that have their roots in the Cold War or the aftermath of World War II, which I find very, very interesting. So
Right. Which, as long as we're on the subject of Michael Chabon, his amazing book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay,
yes.
Is set partially during World War II, but it's about specifically writing a superhero in response to feeling the powerlessness of not being able to do anything about the war in Europe that then expanded. So, again, not really speculative fiction, just kind of straight up literary fiction, but also about comic books and superheroes and speculation.
Sure.
So it's all messy. It's all so messy when you think about this kind of stuff.
It is, but it makes me wonder, just by virtue of being messy. We've talked about the Seven Beauties of Science Fiction by Istvan Tishri-Ronay in past podcasts. And I think we can circle back to him a little bit here in talking about war as a novum, which all of the novums that we've talked about have been messy and hard to define, but still clearly the heart of the works. Novums are the heart of the work, or the soul of the works, essentially. And if you think about American War and some of these other books we've been talking about, war is, occupying the function of novum. So what does that mean? And, maybe let's look at some specific examples of how this plays out.
Yeah.
We have some great books on our list that I want to make sure we don't miss. American War. Let's start with American War. So American War, if you had to summarize it in, 30 seconds or less, how would you do that? What is American War about?
Future Civil War, the North versus the South, a lot of racial tension, a lot of class tension, a lot of gender tension. There's just a lot of tension. The South decides in the end it doesn't want to put up with climate change restrictions towards the end of the 21st century and secedes again. And then we follow one family as they're navigating transition between essentially being refugees to one of the characters becoming well, I won't give too much away, but we follow this family and one person in particular for quite a while.
Yes, and her life is rather messy. If we're going to use that word, this is a perfect time for it. So she occupies a lot of different spaces. She's also not what you would consider a standard protagonist for a text.
No.
She is complicated in a lot of ways. She's a survivor of traumas. She's she's got aspects of terrorist in her. She's got aspects of freedom fighter in her. She's got a lot of things going on in her, and she also happens to have queer aspects about her, although I think Omar El Akkad does a great job steering clear of pinning anything too specific down on her, but she's very clearly queer in some way, shape, or form. She physically occupies a lot of space, and that's very unusual in a sci-fi heroine specifically. So she's gendered female, and she is a big person. She's big, burly, broad, scarred. She is pretty much like she's visually noisy in a way that not a lot of characters who are gendered female in sci-fi are allowed to be. So she's a refreshing heroine, or maybe not heroine, she's a refreshing central character. Yeah. And she's interesting, and her relationships are central to the text in a way that was surprising. So what is the function of war? War is in the title, but what is happening with war in American War? Like, what is Omar El Akkad trying to do with war? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would actually define this book as kind of an speculation. Like, when we say speculative fiction, it's kind of a way to say science fiction and fantasy in polite company, which I think is bullshit, first of all. But, if I had to describe what this book is primarily, I think that it is speculative fiction, because what it is doing, it's looking at the state of affairs in the U.S. right now and extrapolating them logically over many decades, and thinking about, basically when all of the social tensions around racism, around classism, around sexism kind of come to a head at the same time, or what if they came to a head at the same time as climate change policy that finally had to do something because places like Florida in this book no longer exist because they're underwater. What happens with all of that? And he speculates on it in a way that feels scary and real and viscerally right. At the same time, it feels viscerally wrong, if that makes sense. Like, there's something... When I was reading it, there was something inside of me that says, yes, this is accurate in a way that it was portraying its relationships and emotions and characters, and yet wrong in that, you don't want this shit to happen.
You really don't, but it's more wrong because you could see how it could be right.
Yes.
I think, honestly.
Yes.
And if we're thinking about, this particular book in the context of its release year, 2017, this is, in my mind, the most woke sci-fi book of 2017. And I say that actually without irony. I think that this is a book that sci-fi lovers who happen to also be involved in the tensions in Charleston could read and recognize themselves in. Or recognize ourselves as a nation. And, you don't have to be an activist on any level to enjoy this book. But I think that there is something very hardened and sharp and incisive about Omar El Akkad's approach to racial tension, to income discrepancies and lack of resources, and people being unkind to each other while also having enormous capacity to be kind to each other, and laying those two things side by side and showing us how that can play out within one person's life. I think that this is the book that most reflects where we are currently at in 2017. And I think it does a great job of setting up a future that could theoretically happen based on where we're at in 2017. Now, it's not a shiny tech-packed futuristic world. This is, but it's also not a future that's devoid of technology. Like, it's not post-apocalyptic in the way that Revolution, the TV series or something, is, where there's no technology, we've lost it. And it's also not like, some of these sci-fi books where we have genetically engineered ourselves out of having bodies or whatever, it kind of walks this fine line where one of the reasons why it defies genre conventions is that it doesn't have many of the tropes and trappings of sci-fi, which I find really interesting. So, so American War is in the title. Obviously, it's going at it. But what about some of these other texts that we have on our list that don't have war in the title, that maybe aren't advertising themselves as being primarily about war?
Well, let me actually, before we get to some of the other books, or rather, as a way to get to some of the other books, let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Is the primary novum of American War, if we are assuming that it is a science fiction novel in some capacity, is the primary novum war itself?
That is a great question. I'm laughing nervously because I do not know.
Yeah, I don't either, right? It doesn't really seem like it has an easy answer, because when I think of the novum and the way we use it, I immediately go to what is the primary or the most important new stuff in this novel. And what makes this novel in particular so good and so incisive is that the stuff that's new isn't new. None of it is new. Like, you could say maybe that the novum is the Second Civil War itself, but even that doesn't really feel accurate. And none of the tensions or relationships or even the tech that we see in the novel feels particularly new either. And that's not a critique. I think it's really well done. But, maybe by that criteria, if we can't come up with a novum, then it isn't a science fictional novel, which feels a little too cut and dry. But
I think it checks a lot of the boxes that I needed checked at this particular point in time.
I agree.
And those boxes existed because I've been reading other works that have done similar things or have been trying to get at the similar things. Yeah. And I think a lot about Octavia Butler when I'm reading books like American War, in that Octavia Butler may have come first, and she was definitely dealing with some of the same topics and tensions.
Yeah.
but she was doing it in a very different way. And I think perhaps what's so new, and I'm doing big air quotes here, about American War is that it's a book that is not written for traditional sci-fi readers.
Yeah.
It does everything that we want and need out of our sci-fi, I think, in my mind. But it was marketed one of the reasons why I didn't pick it up sooner is I would walk around Barnes and Noble and it was with like the latest Richard Russo or, Fanny Flagg or whatever. It was up front of the bookstore with the new action and adventure and romance reads and things like that. I think it has to do with the way it approaches the reader and delivers to reader expectations and, who it envisions its reader to be, essentially. So I think this is a book that could potentially really explode out the borders of who considers themselves science fiction readers.
Well, I think you're right. And I'm thinking back, too, to our discussion about the Spaceman in Bohemia when, I kind of went on that rant about wanting Spaceman in Bohemia to be more accepted as science fiction because of the way that it really, explodes things in new directions, whereas I didn't want it to go the way of, magical realism for fantasy into acceptable, I'm doing air quotes too, literary fiction. And I think you're absolutely right, and I think that this does some of that work. It really, it picks up after works like Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Yeah. And I think that why those books were sort of checking a different box for me is that I think of the primary novum there as Earthseed itself, like starting the religion, and the fact that we follow a character who is so central to that particular dogma. She comes up with it. She, and obviously there's a lot more in both of those books, but there isn't an analogous idea in American War for me, or there's not really something I can point to and say, that is new, amidst all this stuff that feels so familiar in a productive way.
Well, and I think, too, a lot, especially in context of our alternate history comments about Kindred, Octavia Butler's Kindred, which in my mind does not strike me as science fictional at all, even though it uses time travel to get the plot where it needs to go. American War doesn't strike me as science fictional, even though it uses the setting, the perhaps post-apocalyptic setting, to get the plot where it needs to go. And this total disregard for science fictional tropes is really refreshing sometimes. I'm not going to say as a general rule, but sometimes it's really refreshing.
Agreed. And I think that, at the risk of having this podcast spin off into is it science fiction or not? Again, for the millionth time, I will say, no, it doesn't do some of the things. Yes, it does do some of the things. We're talking about it, so yes, it's science fiction for our purposes, but there's a lot of gray areas. Its boundaries aren't very clear, but we like that.
And we're going to move on to talking about some other texts that most people would agree are science fictional.
Yes. So let me go back to your question now. The reason I wanted to get all of that out of the way is that I think that there are science fiction works for which the war and things that happen in the war, technology, relationships, etc., are the novum. And the two that I thought of immediately were The Forever War by Joe Haldeman and Ender's Game.
Okay, let's talk about the Forever War first, because I haven't read it. So tell me a little bit about Forever War.
So Forever War is exactly kind of what it sounds like. It is kind of allegorical with respect to the Vietnam War. Joe Haldeman was actually in the Vietnam War, so you would expect that a little bit, but essentially it's what it says right on the package. You have a war that's being fought between humans and an alien species, but because he actually considers relativity in this war, or in this novel, you have huge time jumps between that characters experience as, hibernation or a few days or losing some time, but, passes thousands upon thousands of years, and society has changed. And so the war itself is kind of the novum in that it's the new thing, but also this, these relative time jumps and the new societies that come about as a direct result of fighting the war and the relative time jumps, are all kind of the novum that is like bound up and like tied with kind of a neat bow. But the fact that the war is going on is, I think, the novum for Forever War.
So let's talk a little bit about Ender's Game too. So Ender's Game, if you haven't read it, is the story of essentially child soldiers drafted into a program of hyper-intelligent kind of generals in training, or they're basically officers in training from a young age, and they are all brilliant geniuses. So it examines not just the nature of war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but also how we let war affect children, how it affects development in the human psyche, and are things rooted in us inherently, the nature versus nurture debate. Are we destined to be a warring people? So when you read or watch Ender's Game, what do you think what conclusions is it coming to? And should we pay attention given that the author is homophobe?
Yeah, right. And I think that there's some really important critiques of Ender's Game out there. The fact that it kind of almost falls on the side of like Ayn Rand in terms of talking about, the power of the individual, and the fact that everything is so set up to make Ender into this like beautiful, terrible victim of a character. And, we could devote more than an entire podcast to talking about critiques of Ender's Game.
We'll get there eventually.
We will. And there are important things to say, but in terms of the war itself that's going on, I said that it was the novum in part because of the way that it's presented, which is completely different from the Forever War, but really does get at that, what is the relationship of this particular character to commanding a war, to committing genocide, to doing these things. And it, when I first read it, I was really captivated by those questions because I came to Ender's Game fairly early on in my reading of science fiction, and it seemed like a really interesting fresh take on wars in general. And that freshness has not stayed with me, but at the time it was really important, I think. I
think when you're young, it's easy to feel like the literature of science fictional wars is overlooking you, I guess.
Yeah.
Whereas Ender's Game, by having young protagonists, very young protagonists, especially in the book as compared to the movie, you are automatically given access to this story because it is a book with very adult, I guess, material and content, but it is written about young children, and so a lot of young children read it. And in fact, I remember, I don't remember whether it was my first or second time through, but I was picking up someone else's copy, and it had an afterword by the author, and it included some excerpts from letters from children who had written into him after reading the book, the first edition or whatever. It had been like a decade since it had come out. And these kids were saying, you are the first science fiction author who has not talked down to us, who has not underestimated our capacity to grasp these concepts, our intelligence, so on and so forth. So there were some legitimate child geniuses writing it and saying, this actually concerns us. This actually is stuff that we understand and enjoy. So keep writing more of it. And then, of course, he wrote 15 more books. So it turned out okay for those kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. let's skip over some of the texts which have been considered seminal war texts, like War of the Worlds is interesting on its own. We'll probably get to Golden Age sci-fi as its own podcast at some point in the future. Let's talk about His Dark Materials and Aliens, because I can't imagine two more different texts.
No. So, when I think of Aliens, I think of it as the primary example of allegorical war.
And this is the second installation of the series. Okay,
Yeah, right. I think of Vietnam in space, which is essentially, what you see on screen. Obviously, again, there's been so much not criticism, what's the word I'm looking for? There's been so much written about how Aliens is operating on so many different levels, including as an allegory, including, using a lot of that Vietnam War imagery, so I don't want to say a whole lot of that there. But, when I think of science fiction, allegorical war, Aliens is what comes up first.
Okay.
On the other side of that, way on the other side of that, is His Dark Materials, which is kind of, along with Lord of the Rings, the example of fantastical clash between not necessarily good and evil, but a war between power that is almost unimaginable. In His Dark Materials, it's basically the war between heaven and earth refought. That's what's going on. Those are the stakes, told through the lens of a couple of children.
Why is there a war between heaven and earth to begin with? That's kind of one of the things I want to know. Like, it feels like, as you said, you use the term example. Yeah. And we have these archetypes about war that are incredibly, deeply intrinsic to literature. And science fiction is not alone in this, for sure. Mythology got there first in terms of creating a war between heaven and earth. So what is this impulse to set up wars between us and whatever came before us,
Right. Well, Philip Pullman has gone on record as saying that His Dark Materials is in response to, or following up on, or has some relationship to Milton's Paradise Lost.
Okay.
Which tells the story of the original war between heaven and earth, heaven and hell, heaven and
And we say original, but
wherever isn't heaven.
But we mean his understanding of that.
Right, exactly. Not the first book that ever existed on that particular subject, but rather the one that Pullman is referring to as the first
seminal, I guess.
Yeah, the seminal. And just the way that this second war between heaven and the non-heavenly forces is shown in these books is all about response to this question of will, this question of submitting to doctrine and dogma, this aggressive recalcitrance to God, which is never called God in the books, but is called the authority because that particular character is not God. He just got there first. But basically how the systems of Christianity, it is explicitly Christianity in different forms throughout the multiple worlds that the books occupy, has been leveraged across time and space to subjugate people based on gender, based on sex, based on class, based on race, based on all these different things, and how this war is essentially to put a stop to that.
Okay.
To put a stop to this exploitation by heaven and its agents.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so no heavy lifting there at all.
Not in the slightest. It is it's a light read. I would recommend it for anyone. I would actually really recommend it for anyone, but it is not a light read.
As you did for me repeatedly through the years until you finally wore me down. Okay, so those are two examples which are pretty far apart on the spectrum, both in terms of genre. So His Dark Materials is pretty much fantasy with a touch of sci-fi, and then you have Aliens, which is pretty much sci-fi without a hint of fantasy. But okay, so let's include a couple more texts in our canon before we start talking about how these do and do not converse with each other. So we've talked about the Ian M. Banks's Culture series on our podcast a couple of times. And we've also talked about Nnedi Okorafor and Binti. And these are another two examples who probably couldn't be further apart on a lot of different aspects. But
I'm glad you brought those two up, because I was going to bring those two up and say how similar they were. And hear me out here, because I think what both of them do really effectively with respect to war is show the aftermath of war. Because you're seeing in the first Binti, the relationship that evolves between Binti and another character who has traditionally been at war with not necessarily her folks, but the folks who are in charge of the ship that's getting her to the academy that she's going to on a different world. In Culture, you see the Culture Idiran War in the very first book of the series, and then never again. But it's referenced, and it's an important touchstone throughout the whole series because it happened in that first book. And I say that they're both important because there is a really tricky but necessary way to do war in some works of science fiction and fantasy, which is putting it in the background but never losing sight of it. And I think that Culture as a series and Binti as a series both do that very successfully. Yeah.
Okay, well then, just to throw some more salt in the ring. Something that is different then is the Area X series that we mentioned by Jeff VanderMeer, Annihilation and so forth. And so here's a text which never really talks about war and never really claims to be about war. But we put it on the list because both of us thought this is about war, in a sense. It's got war as a central conversation, whether it's happening, in consciously or in the background somewhere. So what do you see as the relationship between war and Area X, which is much more an atmospheric work and relies less on naming a thing in order for it to be important?
Yes, agreed. So this particular point in the podcast grew out of a question that I asked, which said, because war is so primarily the province of space opera, where you have, grand galaxy-spanning wars, and to maybe an equal, maybe a lesser extent, alternate histories and what happens there, what would wars look like in other subgenres or other ways of exploring them? And so one of the questions I asked was, what would a weird war look like? Or what would a war look like via social science fiction? And social science fiction, I thought more about that, and I was like, well, maybe, if we're considering works that have Cold Wars, like in Star Trek or like in The Expanse, where you have these Cold Wars that in some cases turn hot, those works are really founded upon their social science principles. Again, for, the umpteenth time, I think that Star Trek is really trading on the fact that its novum is in part government and the Federation. And we could go more into that for The Expanse as well. But, so I wasn't so curious about that once I thought, okay, well, maybe that's one way to do it. But a weird war, an idea that in the province of weird fiction takes the entire idea of the war and turns it on its head and weirds it and queers it and torques it, like, what would that look like? And thinking about that, Area X seemed like, again, as for so much weird fiction, the perfect example of what's going on there, because it isn't a war at all, and yet it is. In the same way that it's not aliens at all, and yet it is. That it's a paranoid conspiracy, and yet it isn't. And it's just, you can tell, like, there are several things that I love and come back to, and Area X is one of them. But what were your thoughts? How did you see war in Area X? In
Area X, I often think of this in respect to American war as well, where the primary war in question is not between massive groups of people, although they're in the background moving obviously or unobviously across the landscape. But it's wars that we have within ourselves and against our own natures. And in Area X, especially in the Annihilation book, which I still think perhaps is one of the most revolutionary science fictional books I've ever read, the primary character, the biologist, I keep forgetting. The biologist. Yeah. She goes in knowing all these things about herself, and also knowing that she must erase certain elements of herself. She must abandon certain elements of herself. And then over the course of this series, she finds herself to be changed significantly with and without her consent. Yeah. And so she is actively engaged in this process of self-evaluation, of self-determination, and as a necessary consequence, she is at war with herself far more than she's at war with the psychologist or any of the other people on her expedition, although there is, again, very obvious tension that is being written into the story. And I think about this in Born, too, Jeff VanderMeer's most recent novel, where the greatest evils that must be confronted are not the roving bands of vagabonds or the giant bear, Mord. The giant flying bear, I love him so much. But it is, in fact, like our own perceptions of ourselves and the people that we love. And I think that you can call that social science fiction. In fact, we have, and we've also come to the conclusion that, social science fiction is a messy term, like every other term that we've used.
Of course.
but when we look at the other texts that we've mentioned, Binti, Culture, Starship Troopers, Aliens, His Dark Materials, Ender's Game, Animorphs, all of these texts, they certainly include, like, real, and I'm using air quotes here, real battles between opposing groups of people, but always what makes them interesting and what makes them texts which stand out from the bookshelf at the bookstore, it's how they perceive the person or the people at the heart of the story and their relationships among themselves and with themselves. So Ender's Game would not be interesting if it was just a bunch of kids punching each other in zero gravity. We have other books for that. But it's fascinating because it looks at human psychology and the psychology of human development and trauma. And it's, how trauma turns a person's brain against itself and a person's soul against itself. And I find that far more interesting than... there was that television show Revolution a couple years ago, where
is that the one where tea kettles stopped working because technology?
I don't know about tea kettles, but airplanes dropped out of the sky and everything. So basically an EMP knocked out or something, nanotech, whatever, knocked out all technology. And I find that as interesting as it was to see a post-apocalyptic show on main broadcast television, it wasn't as interesting as some of these other texts have been and will be when they're adapted to television or movies, because they deal with, I think, more deeply rooted questions which force us, the reader, to then question ourselves and explore our notions of self and identity. And you can do that without having a sleek, tech-packed, futuristic world. You can do that as time jumps back to the past, like in Kindred or something like that. So and this is my very rambly way of saying I think the texts that we have pulled out are not the only science fictional texts that deal with war, but they say a lot about what we find attractive as two specific readers about the way war is used in science fiction. So take that how you will.
Yeah, right. And, of course, all of our lists of books that we talk about for topics like these are biased towards what we like, what are really the important and canonical set of texts for us. So, of course, always take that grain of salt. But I think, obviously saying what war does in science fiction is too large of a task for us to come up with. But in terms of what we've talked about and our various, interpretations of wars in different texts and why they are so important, I think comes back to really what you just said. The fact that war as a thing as something kind of undefinable other than, what a government or a group of people says differentiates this time from that time, or this place from that place. The fact that we're at war, that's not the interesting part of it. What is the interesting part of it for me, and I think for a lot of these texts, is what happens to the characters, how they're changed by, experiencing those places and those times at which they're told or they internalize that this is war. Mm-hmm. This is what happens during war. Mm-hmm. And that's really the crux of it, I think.
Yeah. And I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but I think that that's a fairly good place to leave today's conversation, which is to say, it's messy. We love messy on this podcast.
Always.
Yeah. And we would really be interested to hear what you, our listeners, have to say about war, and maybe you could recommend some more texts to broaden our list of canonical war science fictional texts. I would recommend that our readers go out and read American War if they haven't already.
Yes, absolutely.
Ignore the jacket copy. Ignore the graphic design on the cover, which, places it amongst a certain kind of text. Really, this is it's a book that defies genre boundaries in a way that's really pleasurable, and it transgresses a lot of genre boundaries in a way that makes it hard to market. But it is a rewarding text, and it definitely, in my opinion, falls in line with other texts by authors of color and so forth who've really upped the ante in science fiction of late. Yeah. So I think you can read American War and put it down and pick up N.K. Jemisin, or put it down and pick up Binti, or put it down and pick up Octavia Butler, and find that it's part of this larger conversation about social inequities and who we are as people when placed in a time of war. And so it's a great book. And you can look for at some point later in the year, Tony, you had this idea that we'll do a awards ceremony.
Yes, we will. At the end of 2017.
Tell us a little bit more about that. How are you envisioning that will play out?
So the Imaginary Awards will be a special podcast that we do at the end of the year when Kendra and I recognize and recommend our favorite books and movies and TV shows of the year. Some of it will be fairly straightforward, like our favorite TV show of the year, our top 5 TV shows of the year, or something like that. But especially for books, because we tend to be biased towards books and talk about a lot of books, I imagine we'll give an Imaginary Award for our favorite novel, for our favorite novella, but then we'll do things like favorite series, most innovative novel, best first novel, things like that as well. So we're really looking forward to it. Both of us are reading a lot more books that are coming out between now and then, but also have come out in the past several months in 2017 than we ever have done before for any previous year. So it's exciting. If you, our listeners, have recommendations for books that have come out in 2017 that you think we would enjoy and want us to talk about, let us know, because we love recommendations.
And I'm going to put together a Goodreads list that will... or maybe a couple of Goodreads lists. And I will link them to our Twitter account, which you can find at imaginary_pod. And that way you can contribute your own votes on what you think are the best books of 2017. And we will be limiting it to books that have been published since between January and December 2017.
Yes.
So we will, as much as we would love to talk about 2016 books, we kind of missed the boat on that one in terms of our current framework. But we will talk about 2017 books. And I think after that, we hope to do a podcast in which we sort of promo upcoming books in 2018 that we're excited about.
Yeah.
And so, you can look for a lot more content of that nature on our podcast. We have now celebrated our 1-year anniversary. We haven't done
it was a while ago.
It was a while ago. So we've been doing this for over a year, and we're kind of starting to move in the direction of systematizing things at last.
Yeah.
I happen to be in a class about comic books and graphic novels for my library science degree. So I probably will make sure that we have a comic and graphic novel category on there.
Cool.
We'll we'll consult Alyssa, who showed up on our podcast early on a year ago, about her favorite comic books and graphic novels and games as well. So
Cool.
Your suggestions are welcome, not just for quote unquote traditional literature, but also for these other forms of entertainment. So please bring on your recommendations. You can tweet them at us. Again, our Twitter account is imaginary_pod. You can find us where else, Tony?
You can find us on our website, which is imaginaries.net. You can find us, or you can listen to us wherever you download your podcasts from, SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, the podcast app if you are on iOS. And I believe that's it.
Yeah, I think for now, those are some good places to find us. And we will look for your comments and feedback, because we are heading into that time of year where we love feedback. So thank you so much for listening to our very messy podcast as usual. And we'll catch you soon.
Yep. All right. Bye.
Bye.